Jeannie Smith, Discourse Analysis, Research Project. Do you notice how when we walk up on a conversation, we usually can tell if it's a good conversation or an argument, even before we hear the words? How do we know that? Since we can't hear the words, it must be from the body language in the non-manuals. But specifically, what non-manuals and or body movements let us know which type of conversation it is. That is where my hypothesis comes from. The hypothesis said, downward or upward movements with special emphasis on eye gaze indicate the communicative participant's emotions. So how I set this up, I had first the participants. I had to think about gender, because that influences the meaning. And I also had to think about culture. The second thing that I set up was the actual mood of the conversation, positive and negative. In order to do all this, to make comparisons, we did a total of 7 videos. I had the 2 men do a positive conversation, a negative conversation. Then we had the 2 females do a positive conversation and a negative conversation. And we actually added a second female-female conversation that was a debate style, because this changed some of the indicators. Then we moved to male-female positive conversation and a male-female negative conversation. Each one of these videos was transcribed and then analyzed. A special key was made to indicate the different eye gaze movements, and that would be downward movement, upward movement, eye roll movement, sideways movement, and also looking straight at each other. And while doing this, I did notice that eye gaze alone was not an indicator. I had to add some things, and I will go over that more towards the end of this presentation. The first one was the 2 females that were talking about something positive, and they were talking about gardening. One of the females was brought up in the south. The other was brought up in the north. They both had different conversation styles, and this is important to note because the southern one spoke softer, had many more hesitations, and she paused, and she had many hedges, such as maybe, you know. Her conversation was punctuated with much of that. And I did notice through all these videos, whenever somebody was thinking about something, a lot of times the eye gaze was down or up. But downward was important because that's what I was looking for. So for her, downward movement occurred a lot, whether it was related to a negative emotion or not. Now when they turned to the negative conversation, here they talked about the tsunami. There were a lot of pauses, a lot more pausing, a lot more hesitations. The downward eye gaze was more frequent, and they did not look at each other as much. There was one interesting spot where they were comparing the Japanese culture, which is collectivist, versus the individualistic culture. And the tsunami, it was reported there was not much looting, everybody took care of themselves. But when you think about Katrina, unfortunately in Katrina in New Orleans, there was a lot of looting and so forth. But when they were talking about Japan and tsunami, they were talking about how the water affected everything and the loot and how there was no looting. Then they both looked down at the floor, and then after about 2 seconds, they looked at each other, said New Orleans, Katrina, at the same time. And they started to laugh. That laughter was not because it was a positive thing, but the meaning of that laughter was showing solidarity with their friendship. I thought that was interesting, even though it didn't relate to the project. And if you're interested in that, look at marker 119. Now the second negative female conversation was a debate. The debate style is totally different. The eye gaze was steady on each other the majority of the time. There were a few pauses and hesitations where they were trying to think of what to say. Only one time was there definitely downward eye movement that was connected to a negative feeling. And that is where the girl that felt she was being attacked, her point of view had been hit twice, and she wasn't sure how to come back. So her eye gaze went down. She was obviously embarrassed, and she said, "Oh my goodness," because she didn't know to come back. That was the only negative one in the whole 5-minute video. Now next we put the men together and we did a positive. On them, the men, one was Californian, one was Northern. The Californian owns a tea shop. That tells you a little bit about personality. The Northern likes to go camping and grilling, and he has a military background. And I should mention the Californian is an engineer, very detailed, very precise. They decided to talk about cooking. The Northern's idea of cooking is grilling outside. So they started talking about, let's talk about cooking. And the Northerner said, I love to cook outside. And the Californian said, why? And the Northerner said, because that's where the meat is. Everybody laughed at that because of the different cultural worldviews. Eye gaze on that, though, was on each other, and there was laughter. Even though the why was a mockery and a you've got to be kidding negative, but there was no downward eye movement with that. The next, they talked about something positive. Now, they talked about something negative, I'm sorry. The negative, they were talking about politics. Well, you know how politics goes. But it was an informative conversation. And the whole time that the explanation was being done by the Californian, his eye gaze was just past the Northern's face. He didn't look at him. Now, the whole time he was explaining, the Northerner looked straight at the Californian. The Californian, when he was explaining some things that were negative, his eye gaze would go down or up if it was more or less he was thinking about how to put it in. There was one point in there where they communicated together because of the tonation and the eye gaze. That combination together let the Northerner know that Californian was talking about a previous subject that they started with. And through all these observations and all the analyzing and so forth, I have found that downward gaze was not always associated with negative emotions. Eye gaze was used in combination with other facial non-manuals to derive meaning. Also body language worked in that. There was culture, personality, worldviews, gender, all of that influenced meaning. So the eye gaze obviously was not the major factor that allowed someone to know whether it's a positive or negative statement. So the evidence did not support the hypothesis. Evidence suggested that the combination of conversation signals, personal attributes, and kinesics work together to form the meaning. In order to do research better, there would need to be many more groups grouped together more similarly. There would need to be further analysis, deeper analysis, and a deeper key than was originally done, and much more material would be needed. Clarification also of positive and negative emotions would be specifically described, and the conversations would be controlled more, and that would be a better research in order to see how eye gaze is related to negative emotions. Thank you.